Okay then. Mental note, try to pick games that work properly in the latest version of DOSBox.
This is Rick Velasquez, running 14B, over.
We're at 14B. I'm picking you up on long-range scanners. Welcome home, sir.
Today on Ancient DOS Games, we're taking a look at a somewhat different game than usual, Traffic Department 2192. This game is very different from the norm because it's more about the story than about the gameplay. In fact, you spend more time in this game being presented with stuff to read rather than going around shooting at everything. Not to mention, many of the missions are more complex than just go here, shoot this, win. However, despite this story-driven approach, which normally works well for games, neither the story or the gameplay hold up through all 3 episodes. Now don't get me wrong, the first episode is pretty good, and the second episode is okay, but the third is just a mess. Anyways, before we get too specific, let's take a look at the game stats. TD2192 was created by P Squared Multimedia and was originally published by Safari Software in 1994, though a company called Monkey Business published a boxed version of the first episode at some point too, though I can't really find much info on that version. It's a one-player action game, which for some bizarre reason uses a tweaked 320 by 192 256 color VGA mode for the gameplay segments, yet uses the standard 320 by 200 resolution for everything else. I'm really not sure why it was programmed this way, unless it has something to do with the way the video memory was being utilized. No, it supports both the PC speaker and Sound Blaster for sound effects, and uses the AdLib for music. As for its current release date, it was made freeware in 2007, and as such, the full game can be found all over the internet now. So I'm just going to recommend the usual place to get it from, the RGB Classics website at www.classicdosgames.com. As you saw already, this game has a pretty tragic start to it, and because this game is all about the story, I'm not going to give too much away. Besides, it's pretty convoluted to begin with, but what it comes down to is that you play the role of Lieutenant Marta Louise Velasquez, who ends up with a chip on her shoulder from the death of her father, and as a result, she's committed herself pretty much to destroying every vulture in existence. The Vultures are a spacefaring race that, for all intents and purposes, conquer worlds throughout the galaxy. While they have the capacity to destroy a planet from orbit, this would leave much of the world's infrastructure devastated with no one left to run anything. So instead, they set themselves up on the ground and attempt to gain control of a planet's inhabitants that way. The story of the game takes you through a variety of locations and a variety of situations, but it suffers from what I like to call annihilation syndrome. I.e., the story ends up killing so many people so often that you eventually stop caring about everyone because there's not really any reason to. Not helped by the lead character that you play as getting increasingly violent and increasingly heartless the more you progress into the story. The only character I feel for when they die is Carl, the dispatcher from the very beginning of the game, because of the hilarious banter he and Velasquez share throughout the entire game. And I'm not really spoiling anything by telling you he dies, because just about everyone in this game dies sooner or later. It's just a question of when. One of the interesting things about the story is that it comes in two flavors, a censored and an uncensored version. Basically, the censored version tones down the violent imagery and removes all the swearing and sexual references. Yeah, the uncensored story is quite colorful, to say the least, but to be perfectly honest, it's not that bad. The F word is nowhere in the script, the S word's only used a little, and as for the sexual references, I think only one of them in the entire game is serious, and the rest are just meant to be jokes or insults. It's a pretty dark and depressing storyline to begin with, so the fact that they offered a censored version seems kind of pointless. But hey, I'm sure they had their reasons. Now, let's get into the gameplay, because no matter how much the story rocks or sucks, this is what's going to make the game fun. Presumably. Now, as you might have already figured out just by looking at it, the gameplay has a fatal flaw that really cuts into the enjoyment. You have an extremely small field of vision. Your hover skid moves so fast and you can barely see any distance in front of you, especially vertically, that you're going to spend a lot of this game watching your little radar at the bottom rather than the action on screen, and even that doesn't help much. You do thankfully have a map you can access, but switching to and from it is just annoying and stops the game in its tracks every time you have to pull it up. Thankfully, that's about the only major negative of the gameplay. Beyond this one fatal flaw, the game's pretty solid. You move around with the arrow keys or numeric keypad and shoot with the spacebar. You can arm missiles with the tab key, engage afterburners with the keypad plus or 0 keys, and when you get a night mission, you can activate your infrared scanners with the alt key. You occasionally also get transmissions coming in over your communication system, which either present new objectives mid-mission, or confirm things that you had a feeling were going to happen. The missions themselves are actually pretty varied, but what makes them the most fun is not only the variety of hover skids in the game, but the fact that sooner or later, you get to try pretty much all of them. Heck, you even get the opportunity to drive a cargo truck. There's also a few missions in the first 2 episodes that allow you to pilot a helicopter which can't fly into the walls, but I find these missions are unfairly difficult because of the limited amount of damage the chopper can do, and the fact that most of the chopper missions are escort missions. And as any gamer knows, escort missions are the worst, especially when you can shoot your own people and you can't see them more than 3 feet in front of you. Regardless of what you're piloting though, you have 2 key stats keeping you alive: shielding and hull integrity. Since weapons fire extremely rapidly in this game, your shields will regenerate very quickly if they're hit, but if you take several hits in a row, you risk the shields going down and allowing your hull to take damage, which doesn't recharge, and if it gets depleted, you die. So essentially, so long as you don't stay in someone's line of fire, you're pretty much invincible. But if you do stay in someone's line of fire just for a second or two, you're probably going to get obliterated. You do have access to missiles too to help you out, but unless you're piloting one of the weaker crafts like the Stingray, they aren't really that useful. Though later on you get access to the Javelin, which has special nuclear missiles that can home in on targets and destroy them easily, though they'll home in on friendly targets just as easily, so be careful with them. A few of the missions are night missions, which require you to activate an infrared scanner to really see what you're doing. This is pretty much just a gimmick thing, and it's barely used much after the first episode. There's also a couple crafts that have afterburners, which give you a burst of speed in the direction you're facing, but the afterburners are difficult to control around corners, so it's best to only use them down nice, straight sections of the roads. One major tip I can give anyone who wants to play this game is to learn how to fly backwards. If you immediately go from moving in one direction to moving in the opposite direction, you fly backwards, and you won't turn around unless you tap a lateral direction first. Reversing and firing is a great way to deal damage to a nearby enemy that you're having trouble with. Another good tactic is to take advantage of the highly predictable nature of the enemy AI. Any enemy not currently pursuing a target or dodging attacks will tend to fly around a particular building. So what you do is set yourself up in one of the corners, face into the oncoming path of the enemy, and lay down a stream of shots so that when the enemy turns the corner, they'll get shredded to pieces. As I said, the game has a great start, but as you get further and further into this game, the quality of the writing, the quality of the missions, the quality of the graphics, the quality of everything just gets worse and worse, ever so slowly. In fact, it's such a slow transition that by the time you realize how bad it's gotten, you're already close to the end of the game, so you might as well finish it anyways. Not to mention, even though the music is decent, it's the exact same music in all 3 episodes. What it unfortunately boils down to is that the shareware version, the one that was free for everyone to try, was where all the effort went, and then it's just downhill from there. Personally, I feel this game has a lot of untapped potential, and that a remake with high-res graphics, a much larger field of view, better AI, a reworked story, and the inability to shoot friendly units would make for an epic and awesome game. As it stands, it averages out to being, well, average. One curious thing I noticed too that I want to quickly mention before I bring up the DOSBox settings is that the first 2 episodes have 20 missions, but the 3rd episode has 19. Yet if you look at the file names, you'll see that there's actually data for a 21st mission for the 3rd episode, yet no data for the 20th mission. And even the dialogue files don't have anything beyond mission 19, so I'm kind of wondering if perhaps the designers had an alternate ending in mind or something. No, it didn't happen, but it would have been fun if it did. Now, just like last week, this is another game that doesn't run properly in the latest version of DOSBox. Well, let me clarify that. The first 2 episodes run perfectly fine in the latest version of DOSBox, but for some bizarre reason, the 3rd episode's AI completely glitches out. I really don't understand why only that 1 episode is affected. I tried every DOSBox setting I could think of to try and fix it, but nothing worked. Instead, if you're going to play this game, it's best to do it with the previous version of DOSBox, version 0.73, which works perfectly fine. You also have to set a fixed cycles count, mostly because of a couple improperly timed things, but it's also absolutely necessary if you intend to use a joystick or gamepad. I recommend a setting of 10,000. If you do use a joystick or gamepad, only the first 2 buttons seem to do anything, so you'll want to use DOSBox's keymapper to really take advantage of all your buttons. The one thing I frequently forget to mention, if you're going to map joystick buttons to keyboard controls, be absolutely certain you set button wrap in the joystick section to false. The button wrap feature has some use if you go with the default controls in most games, but once you start using the keymapper, it just gets in the way. Anyhow, that's all for this episode of Ancient DOS Games. Stay tuned for episode 59, where we're going to take a look at one of the earliest games where you get to drive Formula 1 racing cars. Granted, it only has 3 cars to choose from. If you think you know which games like that, then send your guess to adg@pixelships.com and tune in next Saturday as we set our sights on the checkered flag.